Sometimes life gives us lemons. Sometimes it gives us lemonade. Other times it gives us something entirely out of left field that makes us say, WTF. But no matter what obstacles come, there is most often a way out on the other side, and we are once again victorious. My name is Dr. Rowe, and you are listening to my podcast about resilience. Every guest shares a tragedy to triumph story to give listeners like you the inspiration to push through every single day. Listen now as my next guest shares how they were life-jacked.
What do you do when you receive a phone call finding out that your son has been shot to death? My name is Dr. Rowe, and this is Life Jacked, the Resilience Podcast. Life Jacked is when an unfortunate or unplanned event happens to jack with your life. My guest for this week, Sandy Modell, an institutional wholesaler in financial services and a part-time adjunct professor, will share the heartbreaking story of his son's murder. His son, Ryan, was shot to death in 2016 after mistakenly knocking on the wrong door of a residential home in Fort Myers, Florida. His son's story was featured on William Field's true crime show. Professor Modell also wrote a book titled Murder and Corruption in Florida. This book details that horrifying night. Sandy has been committed to bringing awareness to his son's injustice by challenging the justice system and lawmakers. Hi, Sandy. Welcome. Thank you so much for being a guest on my show. How are you?
Dr. Rowe. Thank you for having me on.
So please tell us, myself and the listeners, we don't know who your son was. So please tell us about your son, Ryan.
Well, very simply, he was just a great son. Wonderful child to raise. A little challenging as a teenager, but aren't they all? We were fortunate. He was active in sports and played tennis locally for the high school and then out at college at the university. Active with family. We all traveled together. We did all kinds of things together, whether it was running in the morning or a beach afternoon, scuba diving. Just an active boy with a lot of imagination and a lot of energy. He did a lot of traveling by himself after college because he really wanted to see things. And so he was very, very active, but never met a stranger, never met somebody he wouldn't help. I can't remember the number of times he was late for either dinner or somewhere else because he'd stopped to help someone or change a tire or done something along those lines. So he was a great son. He was my best friend, and I miss him. I miss him every day. But he was a treasure to have for the almost 33 years that he was my son. Lost him just about 2 weeks before his 33rd birthday.
Yes, Ryan sounds like a wonderful young man, but he was a wonderful young man. And thank you for sharing that about him. Now, as much as you can share, walk the listeners and me through what happened the night that Ryan was murdered.
Well, very simply, it was just a weekend in Fort Myers. And my son, and I'm not sure if you know this, I had lost my wife the previous year. I was married 35 years, and I lost my wife very suddenly. And I spent 35 years building a family, and now 14 months later, here was the second loss. So 14 months building a family, 35 years building a family, and in 14 months, I lost 2 out of 3. And Ryan's mom had a sudden cardiac event. And Ryan talked to people about it and decided that he wanted to learn more about that and go into that kind of a business, that kind of field, so that he could prevent that from happening for other people. And he'd spent 6 months in Boston training on how to manage and build and calibrate cardio devices. And as such, he was just that weekend had been offered a position. He was coming home to Orlando. He was going to be back in Orlando as the chief technician for 3 cardio device clinics. So he had just been offered a position, and some friends were in from out of town, and they were celebrating his new job and one of the friends' birthdays. And they were out at the pool. They stayed later than they should have. And about 2 in the morning, Ryan decided to go back home, back to his condo. He lived in a condo with his girlfriend, and they were on the verge of getting engaged and just waiting for the job to put some clarity into what they were doing. So he walked back from the pool. The problem is the buildings in the complex are not very well lit. Additionally, they're all fairly similar. It's quite monolithic. And Ryan had had a little too much to drink. He went to the correct unit, but the wrong building in the complex. At 2 in the morning, he woke up the residents of that unit, and he thought that was where he was supposed to be. They told him he wasn't, and an argument ensued between the husband and Ryan. The door was slammed shut. They called the police and said, "We've got a drunk kid here. Can you help us out?" Police said, "Stay in your house behind a locked door, and we are en route. We'll be there shortly." That should have been the end of it. Maybe a disturbing the peace charge, I don't know. But Ryan left. And instead of following the instructions set by the police, the owner waited about 4 or 5 minutes and decided he would get a gun and go back outside and look for Ryan. And that's what he did. He went back outside, despite police orders to stay put. When asked about it later, he said, "I was scared." And the police said, "Well, scared people don't leave their units. Scared people stay inside. Can you explain that?" And he couldn't. Then he said he wanted to protect his wife, and they said, "Well, why didn't you stay inside and protect her? Why'd you go outside?" He couldn't answer that. But the bottom line is he went outside, went looking for my son, found him in a neighbor's yard, seated on the ground facing the other way, pointed a loaded weapon at him, and started to yell at him. And when Ryan stood up and turned, in his depositions, the murderer said, "I hit him in the face with the flashlight and put the laser on." Ryan took a couple of steps toward him, and that's when the man from the unit fired a single shot and killed my son. The police have ruled it murder. Florida has stand your ground, but you're not allowed to re-engage. In other words, it has to be one event. It wasn't. The door was shut. Ryan had left. You can't go stand your ground somewhere else. That's pursuit. So you can't re-engage, you can't pursue, and you can't provoke. And in this case, that's what happened on all three of those things were present. Re-engagement, pursuit, and provocation.
Now, I just want to clarify, Ryan was unarmed. I mean, even though he had been drinking, having a good time, but Ryan was unarmed. Ryan walked away. The owner of that particular unit had already called the police, so he had done that.
Tenant.
Say it again, I'm sorry.
He wasn't an owner. He didn't own the unit. He just moved there temporarily because he'd gotten fired from a job in North Carolina, so he was randomly living elsewhere looking for another job. But he didn't own the unit. He was
so the tenant didn't even own or renting, or that wasn't even his place of residence?
Nope.
Wow. And so Ryan had walked away and maybe, passed out or whatever, or just like, okay, you know what, I'm just going to lay down, whatever, as we do sometimes. We've been drinking. You get an argument. Yeah, whatever. We don't know. I don't know. I wasn't there. But it's just amazing to hear that all of these things ensue, that he was unarmed. He walked away. The shooter had already called the police. The police told him to stay put, but he still chose to engage. That's very interesting. It reminds me, and of course this is also in Florida a couple of years ago, the Trayvon Martin case, something very similar. Not entirely, exactly similar.
Well, I understand what you're saying. There are similarities.
Right. That there are some similarities where the victim now is walking away, is not the aggressor, is not engaging, but somehow the person who's somewhat feeling so-called threatened gets to be now the attacker, but claim that they're defending themselves. And this is in Florida. So that's very interesting about Florida law when it comes to this type of case or these types of instances.
Well, it's a very vague law, and consequently, it can be used by a prosecutor, and in this case, it's a corrupt prosecutor, but it can be used as a hall pass for murder. No one has ever looked at this case and seen anything but a murder. In fact, the state attorney, Florida's district attorneys, the state attorney that has refused to charge on this can't explain her decision. And one of the AP reporters down there who's been covering this sort of thing for 35 years said, in 35 years, I've never seen a state attorney that couldn't or wouldn't explain a charging decision. She's the only person that has said there's no crime. Everybody else that's seen it has. For example, my first attorney, you mentioned the Trayvon Martin case. And let me just go backwards for a second to answer something else you asked. Ryan not only was unarmed, he was just wearing a bathing suit. So you couldn't even think, well, maybe he's got a concealed weapon. He was in a bathing suit, no shirt, barefoot. There were two investigations, one original and then one subsequent, once we obtained depositions from the murderer. And the police conducted two investigations, and both times conducted this clearly murder. When you said we don't know what Ryan was doing, when he walked away from the house, when the door got slammed, his foot got caught, and his foot was cut and bleeding. What Ryan was doing when the murderer found him was seated on the ground, using a garden hose, just facing the other direction, but just using a garden hose to wash the blood off his foot. He's not a threat. Now, back to your questions concerning Trayvon Martin. The defense attorney in that was Mark O'Mara, who's considered a statewide expert on stand your ground. Mark was my original attorney, and he looked at this case and read the files and said, there's no stand your ground here. It's impossible. Later on, when I was looking to go at it from a different perspective, my attorney was Ben Crump. Ben is also extremely well regarded with regards to stand your ground and understanding that law. And he said the same thing. He took the case because he said there's absolutely no stand your ground here. So experts from the legal field, former prosecutors, a former state attorney in Orlando, experienced journalists, anybody that's ever looked at this has just seen murder. And the only explanation for it is that the state attorney just refuses to do her job.
So the state attorney chose to not charge the shooter.
She has steadfastly refused to do it. She wouldn't even put the case in front of a grand. She's fairly corrupt, and she's got a bad track record. She wouldn't put it, as we requested, Mark O'Mara requested, when she said, we're not sure what we're going to do. He said, we'll put it in front of a grand jury. She didn't want to do that. She was campaigning. She didn't want to take the time to do that. But more importantly, she had a grand jury 2 years earlier that she improperly led against an indictment. And it leaked out, and she became the subject of a Pulitzer Prize-winning piece of coverage on how bad that whole event was. And consequently, she didn't want to risk it by using the grand jury again. She'd manipulated them in the past, but got caught at it.
So then there was no trial.
There has been no trial. There have been two police investigations resulting in a strong belief, adamancy that it was murder. There is no statute of limitations on murder. So I have been trying to get the governor to move the case from the judicial district where it is. Part of the state attorney's problem is that I supported her opponent in her first election, and I also put up a billboard being critical of her track record and her inability to charge on this. So this was vengeance on her part, which I don't believe is part of her oath. She's supposed to uphold the law, not pick and choose victims based on how she feels about their family members.
That's not a part of her job, is to pick and choose. What she's supposed to do is uphold the law. You're exactly right on that.
Well, Dr. Rowe, that's what she's done. So I've been petitioning the governor for several years to move the case to a new judicial district, independent of this one, and just get an unbiased, objective review of the case. But I have not been able to get that. DeSantis was more concerned about running for president. He was more interested in getting a new job than doing his current job. So he was worried about campaigning, worried about offending the NRA, and has refused to comment on the petitions.
Now, I know that you previously mentioned that your wife passed on before this happened. My condolences to you.
Thanks.
So was there anyone or someone or something in particular that gave you strength to push through during that time and even now, right? Because you're still in the fight.
Right. Well, it's kind of funny. It was certainly a 1-2 gut punch. My wife and I have been together 40 years, and she was clearly the better half of us and the better of the two of us, and I knew it, and I always tried to take good care of that. Losing her was unimaginable, and then 14 months later going through the same thing. The only silver lining anywhere in this was that she didn't have to see it. It's really the only positive I've ever been able to find in any of it. She didn't have to see this. Ryan was the younger of two. He was her baby. He may have been 6'1", but he was her baby, and so this would have destroyed her. And that's the good part. The bad part is when you have a partner to go through life with, you rely on each other during difficult times. And here was one of the most difficult times you can imagine, and unfortunately, she wasn't there. Fortunately, so she didn't have to see it, but unfortunately, there was no assistance.
Well, you seem like an incredibly strong man, strong father. So where do you think your strength comes from that you have now?
Well, I went through a fairly difficult period. The first loss was sudden. So there was devastation, there was disorientation. The world stopped making sense. There was, and then there was nothing. There was just an emptiness. And so that was a struggle. When the unimaginable suddenly becomes sudden reality, it's very, very tough to cope with it. And it just took some time to try and understand it and process it. And I was barely there when I got the phone call you referenced, that there had been a shooting, a murder, and my son was now gone. And so I was still coping with the loss of my wife when that call came through. And now, well, now you think about it, my little boy, my best friend, was gone. And again, I was reeling. Things just weren't making sense. And now, in the span of 14 months, 2 out of 3 family members were gone. So yeah, there was the days, depressed, spiraling, just mental confusion that you would imagine. And it's an interesting fact, when you have a loss, you lose about 90% of your friends. They just do. It's not malicious. They're just not sure what to say or what to do, so they hide a little bit, and all of a sudden, one day turns into 1 week, turns into a month, and now it's awkward, so they continue it. It's not malicious, and it's nothing I ever held against anyone. But again, when you have a loss, you will lose about 90% of your friends. Dr. Rowe, try it twice and see who's left. And there aren't many people left at that point, just a few close friends. And I started thinking about what to do. And I think this is really what you're getting at. I had retired about 18 years ago, about 7-8 years before all this happened. And I'd gone back to grad school. And I'd studied both philosophy and communication and became an adjunct professor. And one of the concepts that I focused on at the time was the concept of the hero. We've got a long history in the United States on heroes. We got it from Europe, from going back to Beowulf and Ivanhoe and the Charge of the Light Brigade and all that. Well, we have it here. Ours started with Westerns and moved on to superheroes like Batman and Superman, and then eventually 007 and the spies that are invincible. So we rely on heroes, and we think of them as these superhuman individuals that can save us. But then there's a problem, and there's nobody in sight. And there are no heroes. And at some point, you very quickly realize the cavalry's not coming. You're on your own. And I started reflecting back to my time as a scuba diver. And I did a lot of diving up north and actually all over the world. And then I started taking some advanced courses. And one of them was rescue. And the concept was interesting insofar as rescue is unlikely. If you're in the water with your buddy and you don't see each other, you lose each other for more than 60 seconds, you surface to reconnect. But if your buddy doesn't reconnect, Now what you have to do is go back to the boat, call for the Coast Guard, and have them come out. And this takes time. You've got a 45-minute tank of air, and they'll probably be out there after that number's up. So it's not really a rescue. It's a search and recovery. And so the rescue training for scuba involves self-rescue and learning how to do the things that will either prevent a problem or learning how to react to them properly so that you can solve the problem. And I started thinking that that's where you're going to find comfort. That's where you're going to find solutions. What you need to do is be your own hero. And it started with self-rescue and then moved on to what in my mind became a 3-phase process. Face it, embrace it, and erase it. Face it. See the problem. Stop fantasizing people are going to come back to life, or everything's going to be okay, or maybe it's a big misunderstanding, or somebody's got amnesia. Stop it. There are a myriad of options that a grieving mind will turn to as possibilities, when in fact they're extremely unrealistic. They don't exist. But you're desperate. And until you face the problem, you can't begin to actually figure out how to solve it. And it's a bitter challenge to actually face it. You're facing loss, unimaginable loss. In my case, 2 of them. But that's step 1. You're going to have to face the problem and see it clearly. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. Now, I have to ask this, and I really like what you said. Face it. Three-phase process. Face it, embrace it, and erase it. I really like that. Now, I do have to ask this, and it may sound like a crazy question, but did the shooter ever apologize to you and your daughter?
No, quite the opposite. The shooter believed that he was the victim. And during some of the police work and subsequent depositions, started sending me unsolicited and without response nasty text messages bragging about what he did.
Wow, I can't even believe that.
Well,
I want to stop for a second to remind the listeners. Ryan was unarmed. Ryan walked away. The person that was saying, who was the shooter, who was staying in that particular unit temporarily, had already called the police. But then he went out after Ryan. And all of that, and he still believes that he himself is the victim.
Yes.
Unbelievable.
Oh, yeah.
Unbelievable.
The text messages he sent were horrible. I've shown them to people, and they were just stunned, absolutely stunned. So no, he's never apologized. He's actually bragged about it. This is a strange individual. He's sociopathic, and the gun he had was a 10 millimeter with an extra magazine in it, a laser, and a flashlight on it. The police said it was a hunting weapon. It's not a self-protection weapon. This is really something to go on offense. And he was known to walk around the neighborhood with an extra 4 or 5 clips in his pocket. So these are oversized. I think they're 10 bullets instead of 6 or 8. And if you've got 5 of them, you now have probably north of 50 bullets just to walk around a middle-class neighborhood in the middle of the day. I'm not sure what he was preparing for. This is someone that was relishing the opportunity to use his gun. I don't think there's any question about it.
Now, we live in a time in America, in the United States. I mean, of course, there are lots of war-torn countries, especially like Israel right now and Ukraine right now. I mean, that is their experience. But in the United States, we have a different type of war, right? It's as it seems. We have this war against each other in a sense. Not everyone, but just about gun violence and the right to, the ownership of guns. And no one is saying no one should have guns, but, maybe we should have better background checks and more stipulations as far as gun ownership, because we are really losing people unnecessarily at alarming rates. And I mean, I myself, I'm not going to lie to you. I have developed anxiety. There are a lot of places. I'm a single mother with 3 sons. There's just a lot of places I just don't feel comfortable going because I don't know if I can protect all 3 boys if something happens and there is a shooter that comes out, right? Which is crazy. That's a crazy mindset, because I've never been in war. I've never been in any type of situation where I've had to, well, once, I think at the park there were some gunshots during a fireworks display or something, and during 4th of July, and I think we had to run. But you know, I've never even been in that situation, but it seems like every time we turn on the news, someone is falling victim to gun violence, and even young children. And even some of these people who are adults, they are still someone's child, just as Ryan was your son. What do you think you could say to parents? I mean, I don't know if you could say anything, because I couldn't even imagine, but, you know, that could give parents support who may have lost a child due to gun violence.
Well, you know, we have the Second Amendment, and I don't get anywhere near it because the Second Amendment is not a problem with regards to my son's case any more than Stand Your Ground is. Those are laws. They exist. Well, one's constitutional and the other is a law. They exist. The problem has been with their application. Now, you say you've never been to war or you've never been subjected to violence, but we get inundated with it from both TV, the news stations, newspapers. The coverage is chronic. It's constant, and there's a serious drumbeat of gun violence all over. So your fears, they sound pretty legitimate to me. I don't think they're fears. I think they're just very real concerns. We have a Second Amendment, but I think we can all agree that not everyone that can get a gun should have a gun. And I don't know how we make the decision of who should and who shouldn't. I understand the Second Amendment gives everybody the right, but that doesn't mean everyone should have one. And so I don't have an idea on how the screening should be done, whether it's mental checks, I mean, some sort of psychiatric evaluations, whether it's insisting on training. I don't know what the solution is, but I certainly agree that the problem is rampant. It's out of control, and it leads a lot of good people, just normal everyday citizens, to have your worries as well, your concerns. Now, going back to what to say to another parent, it's a horrible thing. Losing a child defies the laws of nature. We're not supposed to bury our children. And it's horrible. I don't know, and I hate to start, I keep repeating that word, but I don't know a better way to describe it. And sometimes people say, I can't imagine what you've gone through. And I always tell them, don't try. If you go there, it's pretty dark. What do you say to another parent? Well, I belong to a number of groups that are support groups for families of lost children. Some are violent, some are medical, but it really doesn't matter. Either way, you've lost a child. I don't think anybody that's ever lost a child feels differently because it was a car accident or than someone who it was an illness versus someone who had gun violence. It doesn't matter. You've lost your child. And it's a remarkably painful experience. I belong to 4 different groups, and these are online groups, and I read them, and every once in a while, when I think of something that I've been through that is relatable to whatever they're posting, I will respond. I don't do it often, but sometimes you feel that other people have helped you through, and you owe it to those people coming up behind you to do the same thing. And so I will post. It happens probably 2 or 3 times a month. I'll see a posting in one of those groups. It's something that I have a sense of, something that I've gone through, and I'm able, and I feel not just the ability, but the need to respond and offer not just some general comfort or I'm there for you or sending hugs to you in the universe, none of that stuff, but something specific they may be doing. Some people, for instance, spend a lot of time on dates, the significance of certain dates. Day of loss, birthday, and you've got Father's Day, and you could have an anniversary. There are a number of days that you can observe. And if you do that, you'll find that you start feeling a little sad and weepy about 2 weeks in advance. And then there's about 2 weeks of hang time afterwards. So in my case, with 2 losses, there are probably about 10 days that I could observe. And with 2 weeks in front and 2 weeks behind them, I could be sad for specific dates, probably 10 months of the year. And at that point, you're not living. You're just in a perpetual state of mourning. It's not healthy, and it won't do anybody any good. So in my case, I don't observe dates. I don't pay attention to them. If a significant date falls on a Wednesday, that day is not really any worse than Tuesday or any better than Thursday because I haven't gotten one day further yet. And I caution people against, in my case, I caution them against dates because in my case I have found that they're more of an anchor than anything else. And so in talking with other parents, I've done it. You do less talking and more looking at each other because you look into one another's eyes and you see the pain, they see the pain, and we all understand it. It's not that much that you can say. It's not going to get better. You can't tell people things will be all right in 6 months. They won't. I think sometimes it's those groups only like talking to people in the same shoes because they don't feel that anybody else really understands their pain. And to some extent, it's probably true, but probably not as much as they think.
Now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the billboard that you put up. So in Florida, you put up a billboard before the Republican caucus was happening near the airport. And the billboard featured your book, and it also said, "Do your job, move the case." So what brought on this decision?
Years ago, there was a movie. I don't know if it was Fargo or something else, but it was set in Midwest, I think in Minnesota. And somebody in there used billboards to convey a message. I thought back on that. I've done a lot of things over the last 8 years to try and raise awareness. And that one came up at some point in time. So I put up a billboard in Florida in 2016, 17, critical of the chief deputy district attorney, Amira Fox, who was then running for the open state attorney seat. She was the prosecutor that she was effectively running the office, and she's the one that refused to charge the case. She didn't want to have a whole high-profile case while she was campaigning. This was all driven by her politics and her agenda rather than doing her job. So I put up a billboard in Fort Myers, Florida, critical of her. Now, in recent years, in the last year or two, I've put up other billboards, and I think that's what you're referring to. Last year, before the second Republican debate in Simi Valley, I put up a billboard outside LAX airport. That's the billboard you described. In November, I put up billboards in Des Moines, Iowa, in front of the Iowa caucuses. And in December and January, I put a billboard up in, which is a little bit east of Manchester, New Hampshire, in front of the New Hampshire primaries. And they all said similar things. They talked about, they displayed the book, and they challenged the governor to do his job, to, I don't remember the wording on all of them, do his job, do something honorable, do what you ought to do. You know it's a murder case, act accordingly. So there were over a few months, there were a total of, probably 4 billboards last year. In Des Moines, the viewership on one of them was about 900,000 views per month. Maybe it was 750. On the other one was 150,000. I think I had 900,000 views a month for a 30-day period in Des Moines. So it got eyeballs on it. It was at the end of an off-ramp, one of the busiest highways in town. There was a stoplight next to a major hospital. So it got great viewing, and that was the idea.
Now, did anything result from putting up the billboards, do you think?
Well, sure. First of all, it drove. I have an online petition at change.org, and it drove signatures onto that website. It's just change.org. It's Justice for Ryan and Justice for Ryan Modell on the change.org petition. It's still up, still collecting signatures. So the billboard helped drive signatures there, just as I'm hoping your show will help drive signatures there. The other thing it did, because the book was highlighted, was it's generated book sales. Now, I'm not an actual author, and I'm not in the book sale business, but I am in the raising awareness business as a grieving parent. So I wrote the book and highlighted it on billboards to sell books, and there's no profit in them because they're on Amazon, and the price is low enough that it just covers Amazon's printing and shipping charges. There's no money in it for me. It just raises awareness. And fortunately, the billboards did raise awareness, which meant book sales, which meant more people would get a better understanding of the story.
And I'm glad you mentioned your book, and so I want to talk about that. So led to the decision for you to write the book Murder and Corruption in Florida?
Ben Crump. Ben was my attorney. We did a press conference July of 2022. He had to be at an event in Naples, Florida, so we did the press conference somewhere between Naples and Fort Myers. And afterwards, just as the press conference stopped, the rain let loose, and Ben and his office managing partner and myself ran into their car, their rent-a-car, and we talked for a couple minutes. And Ben looked at me and said, "You should write a book." And he said he thinks thought it'd be a great idea, it would raise awareness. And so it was his idea. And I resisted it for about 7 or 8 months. I was hoping some other piece of lightning bolt would hit and I wouldn't have to go to the trouble of writing a book. It's a lot of work, obviously not a topic I enjoyed. So I pushed it off for about 8 months and then did, in fact, write the book. The foreword's by Mark O'Mara, and the book came out late in 22. So maybe it was 21. It was July of 21 we did the press conference. And then I started writing in the spring of 22, and I think it was done by fall of 22.
So at this time, what is the current status with your son's case?
Well, in the 3-phase process that I mentioned up front, once you have faced the problem, now you've got to embrace it. And by that I mean, don't expect somebody else to help you. Don't expect someone else to fix it. Don't expect it to fix itself. Take ownership. Take ownership, and now that the problem is yours, you've accepted that, and you've got to move forward. But first and foremost, embrace it. Make sure you understand it's yours, and until you fix it, it won't be fixed. Which leads to phase 3, or step 3, which is erase it. Move forward. How do you do it? How do you move forward? What actions are necessary? And what do you have to do to bring about the result that's going to erase that problem? And so for me, that's been a combination of things. That's been petitions to the governor, which he refuses to reply to. It's cowardly on his part. If a journalist calls his office, the governor's office, and says, "What's the status on the petition?" And I've got 3 in there that go back 4 or 5 years. If a journalist asks, all they will say is, "It's under review." It's been under review for 5 years. Cowardly. Just plain cowardly. So petitions to the governor. Interviews with the press. TV, print, podcasts, obviously writing the book, billboards. Any time I can think of something creative that's attention-getting that will raise awareness for my son's case, that's what I do. And I'm still doing it. It's an ongoing process. The state attorney refuses to budge. She can't explain how it stands your ground. Law enforcement has been great. The Fort Myers Sheriff's Department has been nothing less than sensational. In my book, they are the heroes. But the state attorney's office, usually those are the offices that help out victims of homicide victims, family of homicide victims. No, never heard from them. They refuse to return calls. And more importantly, she claims that there's no crime. And yet she's been besieged by her own staff and legal experts who have said this is clearly murder. How do you see it any other way? And she refuses to answer. She doesn't have an answer. She's just corrupt. So the case is still open. And it's an ongoing effort for me to raise awareness and try and find different ways to get enough pressure on the governor's office that the case gets moved to an honest, unbiased district for a clean, honest review. That's kind of what I'm looking towards. That's what my actions are heading towards. I do believe that I will get there. Certainly comfortable and gratified by the fact that there's no statute of limitations on murder. So it's a when, not an if. We'll get the case moved. There'll be no high five moment. As you can well imagine, there's no point where I get the case moved, an honest state attorney sees the case, reviews the facts, and charges the murderer as he should be charged. Then there's the conviction, and they put him in prison. Now what? My son doesn't come home. So there's no high five moment here. But I owe it to my wife, and I owe it to my son to make sure I leave no stone unturned in terms of finding justice for him, which gets back to face it, embrace it, erase it, And once you realize the cavalry isn't coming, you put on your cape and you become your own hero. And that's what I'm trying to do. It's not a question of heroes do extraordinary things. They just do what's necessary under extraordinary or unpleasant circumstances. And we all do it when we have to. I don't think most parents would do any less.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Modell, and I do wish you, the best of luck. I'm optimistic that you're correct, that it's not if, it's when, they decide to charge the murderer in your son's case. So I have to ask you, in your opinion, what are the best ways to build resilience?
Well, I think one of the best ways, and I don't mean to laugh, but it's when you have no choice. When you have choices, we will try and take the least difficult option or the least painful option. There is nothing that I've done in the last 8 years that hasn't involved an enormous amount of pain. But I've had no choice. So sometimes you just have no other options. I can either look for justice or I can cave. I can push the authorities and raise awareness or step back. My son told me something of great value to me. He was a very serious comfort after I'd lost my wife. And it was a very dark period for me. And he told me once, he said, there are always places to find peace and joy and happiness. You just have to look for them. And over the past years, I've learned he's correct, that there are always places to find joy and peace and happiness. You do have to look for them. It doesn't mean giving up the fight that I'm so determined and committed to. It just means there are places to be happy and there are things to be joyful about. And you can balance your life somewhere between recognizing the fun things and the positive things, as well as your obligation and commitment to finding justice.
Well, Professor Modell, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you. Can you do me a favor and take the time to let everyone know either what you've mentioned before, but, how everyone can get a copy of your book, and also how they can support you by signing the petition Justice for Ryan on change.org, or support you at any point.
Well, there are 3 things that can be done. One is just go on to change.org and look for Justice for Ryan Modell and just support the petition. All the petition says is move the case to a new district for an honest and unbiased review. If the state attorney, if you read the Florida laws on judges and recusal, the conflict she has because of things she has sent me and said to me, the conflict she has, if she were a judge, she would be ordered to recuse. And she should be held to no less a standard. It should be the same standard. So, number one, the petition, people sign that petition online. It's just a click, and it will help raise awareness and build support for the petition. Number 2, the book is available on Amazon. I think it's $9.95, and it lays out the case very, very clearly. There's no profit there. I'd love to tell you I'm making a fortune on it, or that all the proceeds go to something wonderful. There are no proceeds. Amazon makes the money, but the book will demonstrate quite clearly that this was a murder and that the government has failed to do its job in protecting or enforcing law and leaving other people protected. Because right now, this guy is free. He's got the same gun, the same attitude. What do they do the next time he kills somebody? And I believe he will, left alone. Left to his own devices, I will. So the petition, the book, and finally just call the governor's office and ask, what's the status on the petition to move the case? If the governor's office gets enough phone calls, that case will move to a new district. That's the only thing the governor cares about, are voters and his public image. I'm disappointed that the integrity that should be there isn't. But if your listeners are able to help contribute to pressuring him into moving the case, I'll take that victory that way. I'll take it for the right reasons or for the wrong reasons. Doesn't matter to me.
Any last words of encouragement for the listener?
Well, there are always difficult things in life. Sometimes they're far more difficult than we ever expected. I believe Einstein said the reason for time is so everything doesn't happen all at once. And the other reason is that we can't foresee the future is because we couldn't handle it if we did. And I think that's certainly the case here. So we tend to be stronger than we expect, and we tend to rise to whatever the circumstances require. And I've been helped along the way by a lot of good people like yourself and your listeners. So nobody fights this battle alone. I've had help along the way, and I'm hoping to get more help as we go. And I'm optimistic at some point in time, this case will get moved, it'll get prosecuted, and a murderer will be put in jail.
Well, Professor Modell, I wish you and your family nothing but blessings and abundance. And we will continue to honor the memory of Ryan. As soon as we get off of this interview, I'm going to go to change.org, and I am also going to sign the petition. Thank you so much for being a guest. Please take care.
Dr. Rowe, thank you again for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I appreciate it.
Hey, are you really loving this podcast, or did you really enjoy this week's episode? Then please subscribe, like, rate, and leave a review. It's very much appreciated. And remember to live, laugh, love, learn, and then repeat. See you in the next episode.